The Thai lawyer looked at the list I'd printed and brought to her office. 17 separate items, 17 things Achara had told me were legally required for marriage in Thailand. 17 cultural obligations that had cost me 36,500 Australian dollars over 13 months. The lawyer read through the list slowly. Her expression didn't change until she reached item number 9. Then she looked up at me with something between confusion and pity. She said, "This is not Thai marriage law. None of this is Thai marriage law," and asked me where I got this information. I told her my girlfriend explained it was all required. The lawyer set the paper down carefully and told me I'd been systematically lied to about Thai legal requirements for marriage. Not one item on that list was legally mandated. Not the monthly payments to her parents, not the village elder consultation fee, not the family business investment, not the Buddhist ceremony deposit, not the registration office gifts, none of it. I'd spent over a year complying with fabricated legal obligations, while my own voice disappeared completely under the weight of manufactured cultural authority. I'm Martin Aldridge. I'm 62 years old. I worked 34 years as an accountant in Brisbane before retiring early. My entire professional life was built on careful observation, methodical analysis, and never making assumptions without verification. I prided myself on being thorough, on thinking before acting, on understanding systems completely before participating in them. That same careful nature made me perfectly vulnerable to what happened in Thailand. Because when you're naturally inclined to observe and listen rather than question and challenge, and when someone recognizes that tendency and systematically exploits it, you can lose yourself entirely without even noticing the process until it's complete. I arrived in Thailand in November of my first year after retirement. I'd spent 6 months reading about the country. I'd taken online Thai language lessons. I joined expat forums and read hundreds of threads about cultural adjustment and relationship dynamics. I thought I was preparing myself properly. What I was actually doing was creating an information vacuum that someone would eventually fill with whatever narrative served her purposes. The plan was to spend 6 months in Chiang Mai observing Thai life before making any decisions about long-term plans. I was naturally cautious about everything, about where to live, about how to interact with people, about cultural practices I didn't understand. I told myself this caution was wisdom, that I'd learn by watching and listening rather than by making assumptive mistakes like other foreigners I'd read about online. I met Achara in month 3 of my observation period. She was 33, from Rayong in eastern Thailand, and she worked at a travel agency in Chiang Mai. She spoke intermediate English with careful precision. She was patient with my terrible Thai. She seemed to appreciate that I asked questions about culture rather than assuming I understood everything. Looking back, I can see exactly how that appreciation was calculated. She'd identified my pattern immediately. I was the foreigner who observed silently, who wanted to understand before forming opinions, who was terrified of being another ignorant farang making cultural mistakes. That personality type is exceptionally easy to manipulate if you're willing to fill every silence with assertions that go unchallenged. Our first month of dating established the framework that would govern everything that followed. Achara positioned herself as my cultural interpreter, my guide to authentic Thai life, my protection against the embarrassment of cultural ignorance. She explained customs I'd never heard of. She corrected my limited understanding of things I'd read about. She provided context for social situations I didn't know how to navigate. And I accepted every explanation without verification because that was my nature. I observed. I listened. I absorbed information. I didn't challenge or question because challenging felt aggressive and questioning felt disrespectful. My entire personality was built on thoughtful reception rather than skeptical interrogation. The first financial request came in month 2 of our relationship. We were having dinner at her apartment when she mentioned Thai culture required girlfriends to send money to parents every month as respect payment. She said the amount should match what a Thai boyfriend would send, which for someone with her education level and family background would be 15,000 baht monthly. She explained this very calmly and factually, the same way she'd explained other cultural practices I'd learned about through her. I didn't question it. I'd read about filial obligation in Thai culture. I'd seen other expats mention supporting their partners' families. The specific amount seemed reasonable given what I'd observed about cost of living and income levels. I asked if there was a proper way to send the money, and she said bank transfer directly to her mother was most respectful. I sent 15,000 baht that evening. What I didn't know, and wouldn't learn until I was sitting in that lawyer's office 13 months later, was that there is no cultural requirement for monthly respect payments to a girlfriend's parents. Adult children often support aging parents financially, but the idea of formalized monthly payments from a boyfriend as cultural obligation was completely invented. She'd taken a real cultural value about family support and transformed it into a structured extraction system with manufactured rules about amounts and timing. But I had no way to know that because I never asked anyone else. I never Googled it. I never mentioned it to other expats or Thai acquaintances. I just quietly complied because she'd told me it was culture, and I'd already established myself as someone who deferred to cultural authority rather than questioning it. The pattern accelerated after I'd sent 3 months of payments without question. In month 5, Achara explained that Thai marriage culture required certain preparations that cost money at specific stages. She said now that we'd been together 6 months and were discussing future plans, we needed to begin the cultural process properly. She explained the first requirement was consultation with village elders in her hometown, who would need to approve our relationship match before we could proceed toward engagement. I asked what the consultation involved. She said it was traditional meeting, where elders assessed compatibility based on birth dates, family backgrounds, and astrological factors. She said the consultation fee was typically 25,000 baht, paid in advance to show seriousness of intent. She said if I waited too long to do this step, her family would think I wasn't serious about her. I sent the money the next day. I didn't research village elder consultations. I didn't ask if this was common practice. I didn't question why compatibility assessment would cost nearly 600 Australian dollars. I just absorbed the information she provided and acted on it because that was my established pattern. I observed and complied rather than questioned and verified. Looking back now, I can see how the system was structured. Each compliance created precedent for the next request. Each unopposed claim established her authority to make further claims. Each silence on my part reinforced that I wouldn't challenge her cultural assertions. She was building a framework where she could make increasingly expensive demands by invoking culture, and my personality type guaranteed I wouldn't disrupt that framework by actually investigating her claims. Month 7 brought the family business investment requirement. Achara explained that in traditional Thai culture, when a man planned to marry into a family, he was expected to invest in family business to show he understood marriage meant joining the entire family structure, not just partnering with one person. She said her family had a small restaurant in Rayong that needed expansion capital to grow properly. She said, appropriate investment amount for someone with my financial situation would be 80,000 baht. This was the first request that triggered any doubt in my mind. 80,000 baht was nearly 2,000 Australian dollars. That seemed significant for what was described as a cultural expectation rather than a voluntary investment. I asked her if all Thai foreign couples did this family business investment. She said yes, it was standard practice, though amounts varied based on the man's financial situation. She said refusing to invest would signal to her family that I saw her as separate from them, which was deeply disrespectful in Thai culture. The doubt lasted about 45 minutes. Then I sent the money. Because even though something felt slightly off about the request, I didn't trust my own instincts enough to actually investigate. I told myself that my discomfort came from Western individualistic thinking that didn't understand collectivist family structures. I told myself that cultural practices that seemed unusual to me weren't invalid just because they differed from what I was familiar with. I rationalized my doubt away, rather than treating it as signal to verify. What I should have done was ask 3 Thai people who weren't connected to Achara whether family business investment was a standard pre-marriage cultural requirement. What I should have done was Google whether this practice existed. What I should have done was post on an expat forum asking if anyone else had encountered this expectation. Any of those actions would have revealed immediately that she was inventing obligations. But I did none of those things, because my natural personality tendency was to assume my confusion indicated my ignorance rather than someone else's deception. I was a silent observer who interpreted his own questions as signs of insufficient understanding rather than appropriate skepticism. Month 9 introduced the Buddhist ceremony deposit requirement. Achara explained that before formal engagement could happen, we needed to complete a specific Buddhist ceremony that would bless our relationship and ensure good karma for our marriage. She said the ceremony required advance deposit to the temple of 40,000 baht to reserve the monk's time and cover ceremonial materials. She said this deposit would be applied toward the actual ceremony cost when we scheduled it, but had to be paid in advance because temple scheduling was very complicated. I asked which temple we'd be using. She said she was still coordinating with her family about the most appropriate temple based on our birth dates and the astrological calendar. I asked when we'd know the ceremony date. She said probably in 3 or 4 months once the scheduling was finalized. I asked if I should speak directly with the temple to understand the ceremony process. She said no, that would be inappropriate because temple communication had to go through family elders first as a sign of respect. I sent 40,000 baht the next day. I didn't contact any temple. I didn't research Buddhist engagement ceremonies. I didn't ask Thai friends whether this type of advance deposit was normal practice. I just accepted her explanation and complied because I'd already established that pattern so thoroughly that breaking it felt impossible. Each request followed the same psychological structure. Achara would present a cultural obligation as established fact. She'd provide enough detail to make it sound legitimate without providing so much detail that contradictions would become apparent. She'd frame any potential question I might have as cultural insensitivity rather than reasonable inquiry, and she'd invoke urgency or family expectations to prevent me from taking time to independently verify her claims. The system worked because I never said no. I never said wait. I never said let me research that first. I never said I need to understand this better before committing money. My entire personality was built around careful observation before action, but somehow in this relationship I'd inverted that pattern completely. I was taking action based on her observations rather than my own. I'd transferred my analytical processes to someone else entirely. Month 11 brought the village ceremony requirement. Achara explained that before we could proceed with official engagement, her village required a traditional ceremony where I'd be formally introduced to the community and where village leaders would publicly accept me into the social structure. She said the ceremony involved specific gifts for village elders, food preparation for community members, and symbolic offerings that represented my commitment to becoming part of the village. She said total cost would be approximately 55,000 baht. I asked how long the ceremony would last. She said typically 3 to 4 hours. I asked how many people would attend. She said probably 70 to 80 community members. I asked what specific gifts were required for village elders. She said traditional gifts that showed respect like quality whiskey, special food items, and cash in ceremonial envelopes. I asked if we could do a smaller ceremony with less expense. She said that would be extremely disrespectful to her family and would cause them to lose face in the community. I sent 55,000 baht. I didn't ask to speak with anyone from the village. I didn't research village acceptance ceremonies. I didn't question whether this level of expense was standard practice. I just complied because that was the only pattern I knew how to follow at that point. Looking back, I can see how the financial escalation was carefully managed. She started with 15,000 baht monthly payments that seemed reasonable given general knowledge about family support norms. Then she introduced one-time payments that were larger but presented as standard cultural milestones. Then she increased both the frequency and amount of requests, while maintaining the framework that all of this was simply how Thai culture worked. And I never questioned it because every time I had a doubt, she had a cultural explanation that made questioning feel like ignorance or disrespect. When I wondered if amounts seemed high, she explained that my financial situation meant higher appropriate contribution levels. When I wondered if timelines seemed rushed, she explained that cultural processes had their own rhythms that outsiders didn't naturally understand. When I wondered why everything required advance payment, She explained that Thai culture operated on different trust and timing structures than Western systems. She had an answer for everything. And every answer reinforced that she understood Thai culture and I didn't, which meant I should trust her explanations rather than my own instincts. The psychological impact of this system was significant, but gradual enough that I didn't recognize it until much later. I stopped expressing opinions about anything related to Thai culture or our relationship planning. When other expats talked about their experiences, I stayed silent rather than sharing mine because I wasn't sure if what I was experiencing was standard or not. When Thai acquaintances mentioned their own marriages or family obligations, I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to reveal my ignorance by comparing my situation to theirs. I became completely passive in the relationship. I received information rather than sought it. I complied with requests rather than evaluated them. I absorbed cultural assertions rather than verified them. My entire sense of self as someone who thought carefully before acting disappeared completely. I'd become a silent observer who somehow wasn't even observing anymore, just receiving and complying. Month 13 brought the engagement timeline crisis. We'd been together just over a year. I'd sent approximately 36,500 Australian dollars for various cultural obligations. Achara said we needed to finalize engagement plans because her family was receiving pressure from the community about our relationship status. She said in Thai culture, when a couple had been together over a year and the man had begun cultural preparations, not proceeding to engagement quickly would cause the woman's family to lose face. I said I wanted to move forward, but I wanted to understand the complete picture of what engagement and marriage would require financially. She said she'd already explained all of this. I said I'd like to see it written down so I could plan properly. She said Thai culture didn't work that way. Cultural obligations evolved organically based on family situations and timing. I said I just wanted clarity. She said I was questioning her family's culture, which was deeply disrespectful. That was the first time I'd pushed back on anything. The first time I'd asked for verification or clarification beyond just accepting what she told me. And her response was immediate emotional escalation. She said I clearly didn't trust her. She said I was treating her family's culture like it was some kind of scam. She said if I really loved her, I wouldn't need everything written down like a business contract. She said my questioning proved I didn't understand Thai culture at all. I apologized. I said I wasn't questioning her culture, I just wanted to understand better. She said the way to understand was to trust her explanations, not to demand Western-style documentation for everything. I said I trusted her. She said then I should stop asking questions that made her family think I was hesitant about our relationship. I stopped asking questions, but something had shifted slightly. I couldn't identify exactly what, but the emotional intensity of her response to basic request for clarity had created a small crack in the framework of unquestioned acceptance I'd been operating within. I didn't act on that crack. I didn't investigate anything. But it existed, and it made me slightly more aware of the pattern I was trapped in. The awareness created internal tension without creating any change in behavior. I noticed when she invoked culture to shut down questions, but I still stopped asking questions. I noticed when she framed my requests for information as disrespect, but I still apologized for making those requests. I noticed the escalating financial demands, but I still sent money. I was observing the system while remaining completely paralyzed within it. Month 14 brought what Achara called the pre-engagement family meeting requirement. She said before official engagement could occur, there needed to be formal meeting between her parents and me where specific marriage expectations would be discussed and agreed upon. She said the meeting required certain ceremonial elements including food preparation, gift presentation, and contribution to family household fund to demonstrate seriousness. She said total cost would be approximately 45,000 baht. I asked what topics would be discussed at the meeting. She said marriage timeline, living arrangements, family support expectations, and cultural obligations. I asked if we could discuss those topics in advance so I understood family expectations before the meeting. She said no, that would be inappropriate because Thai culture required those discussions to happen in formal family context. I asked why the meeting required 45,000 baht. She said Thai culture required hosts to be compensated for preparation time and that gifts for parents had to be appropriate to the occasion's significance. I told her I wanted to think about it. She said there was nothing to think about. This was standard cultural process, and delaying it would insult her family. I said I needed a few days to review my finances. She said I'd been sending money for over a year. Obviously, I had available finances. I said I wanted to make sure I was planning appropriately for all future requirements. She said I was stalling because I didn't really want to marry her. I sent the 45,000 baht that evening. The emotional manipulation framework was fully established by this point. Any hesitation on my part was interpreted as inadequate commitment to the relationship. Any request for information was framed as cultural disrespect. Any question about financial requirements was positioned as evidence that I cared more about money than about her. The system left no space for reasonable verification or boundary setting without being cast as the person who didn't understand culture and didn't truly love his partner. I was depressed by month 15. I didn't recognize it as depression at the time. I just knew I felt exhausted constantly. I wasn't sleeping properly. I'd lost interest in activities I normally enjoyed. I felt disconnected from my own thoughts and preferences. I'd stopped having opinions about anything. I'd become entirely passive. The depression manifested primarily as complete loss of voice. In conversations with Achara, I listened and agreed. When she told me what Thai culture required, I complied. When she framed my questions as disrespect, I apologized. When she escalated emotionally in response to any hesitation, I immediately reversed course. I had no positions of my own anymore. I just existed as a receiver of information and a source of compliance. Looking back, I can see I'd lost myself completely trying to adapt to what I believed was Thai culture. But at the time, I couldn't see that clearly. I just felt this overwhelming sense of confusion about my own values, my own judgment, my own right to have questions or boundaries. I'd spent so long telling myself that my doubts represented ignorance rather than appropriate skepticism that I'd erased my own capacity for critical thought. The trigger for everything changing came in month 16, completely by accident. I was having coffee with another Australian expat who'd been in Thailand for 8 years. He mentioned his Thai wife's family had never asked for any money beyond reasonable wedding expenses that they'd discussed and agreed upon in advance. He said his wife actually discouraged him from sending money to her parents because she wanted them to maintain financial independence. I didn't say anything in response. I just absorbed this information. But it created enough cognitive dissonance that I finally did something I should have done over a year earlier. I Googled Thai marriage legal requirements. What I found was Thailand's Marriage Registration Act, the actual legal requirements for marriage registration in Thailand. I read through the official documentation from Thailand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I read through multiple legal advisory sites. I read through expat forums where people discussed official procedures. There was no mention of village elder consultations, no mention of family business investments, no mention of Buddhist ceremony deposits, no mention of village acceptance ceremonies, no mention of pre-engagement family meeting contributions. None of the things Achara had presented as cultural and legal requirements appeared anywhere in actual Thai marriage law or in verified cultural resources. I spent 4 hours reading everything I could find about Thai marriage requirements, Thai engagement customs, Thai family obligations, and common scams targeting foreign men in Thailand. What I discovered was that virtually everything Achara had told me was either completely fabricated or was massive distortion of actual cultural practices. Sin Sod was real, but it was negotiated between families and was often returned or contributed to the couple's household. Monthly family support was common, but it was voluntary contribution based on the couple's financial situation, not required cultural obligation with set amounts. Buddhist ceremonies for marriages existed, but they happened after legal registration and were paid directly to temples based on actual service costs, not through advance deposits paid to girlfriends. I'd paid 36,500 Australian dollars for cultural obligations that didn't exist. The next morning I made an appointment with a Thai family law attorney. I brought printed documentation of everything Achara had told me was required for marriage in Thailand. I asked the lawyer to tell me which items were legally mandated, which were cultural expectations, and which were neither legal requirements nor authentic cultural practices. The lawyer reviewed my list carefully. Then she explained that none of the items were legal requirements for marriage registration. Some were distorted versions of cultural practices. Several were complete fabrications. She said the pattern I'd described was consistent with systematic financial exploitation using manufactured cultural authority. I asked if she could put that assessment in writing. She provided a detailed letter explaining actual Thai marriage legal requirements, common authentic cultural practices with typical cost ranges, and identification of which specific claims I'd been told were inconsistent with both legal requirements and authentic cultural norms. I paid her 2,000 baht for the consultation and documentation. It was the best money I'd spent in 16 months. I didn't call Achara immediately. I spent 2 days processing what I'd learned, not just the financial deception, though that was significant, but the complete psychological manipulation system she'd built using my own personality traits against me. She'd identified that I was a silent observer who deferred to cultural authority. She'd recognized that I would absorb information rather than verify it. She'd understood that I would interpret my own questions as ignorance rather than appropriate skepticism. And she'd built an entire exploitation framework around those personality characteristics. Every time I had a doubt, she had a cultural explanation. Every time I wanted to verify something, she framed verification as disrespect. Every time I hesitated, she created emotional urgency. She'd systematically dismantled my capacity for independent judgment by framing every exercise of judgment as cultural insensitivity. The system was remarkably effective because it worked with my existing personality rather than against it. She didn't have to force me to be silent and compliant. I was already inclined toward observation and deference. She just had to create a framework where those tendencies guaranteed compliance with her demands. I called her on the 3rd day after the lawyer consultation. I said I needed to discuss our relationship and the various cultural requirements I'd been fulfilling. She immediately became defensive and asked what I meant by that phrasing. I said I'd consulted with a Thai lawyer about marriage requirements. She said, "Why would I do that? Did I not trust her explanations of her own culture?" I said I'd learned that none of the things she'd told me were required for Thai marriage registration were actually required. She said her lawyer didn't understand traditional culture, only modern Bangkok culture. I said I'd also researched traditional cultural practices and the things she'd claimed were requirements were either fabrications or massive distortions. She said I was insulting her family by questioning their culture. I said I had documentation from a Thai legal expert explaining actual requirements. She said she didn't care what some Bangkok lawyer said. Her family culture was different. I said family culture doesn't override legal reality or create financial obligations that don't exist. She said I was being disrespectful and cruel. I said I needed her to explain why she'd told me things were required when they weren't required at all. She tried 6 different deflection tactics. First, she claimed regional cultural variation made different practices standard in eastern Thailand. Then she said I was misunderstanding what she'd explained, and she'd never claimed things were legally required, only culturally appropriate. Then she said I was treating her culture like it was fake, which proved I didn't respect Thai people. Then she accused me of caring more about money than about our relationship. Then she started crying and said I was attacking her family. Then she said if I didn't trust her explanations of culture, then we couldn't be together. I stayed quiet through all of it. Not my usual silence of compliance, but silence of observation. I was watching the manipulation tactics deploy in real time. Cultural authority claims, definitional shifting, victimization reversal, financial guilt, emotional escalation, relationship threats. The entire system laid bare because I wasn't immediately capitulating. When she finally stopped talking, I asked one question. I asked where the 80,000 baht for her family restaurant investment had actually gone, given that her family didn't own a restaurant. There was a long silence. Then she said I'd obviously been spying on her family, which was incredibly disrespectful, and proved I never trusted her. Then she ended the call. I didn't try to call back. I sat in my apartment reviewing everything I'd learned over the previous 3 days. Actual Thai marriage requirements required only valid passports, affirmation of freedom to marry, and registration at district office with 2 witnesses. Total cost, if you didn't have wedding ceremony, 0. Typical Sin Sod for someone with Achara's background, 50,000 to 100,000 baht, often returned. Typical family support, voluntary amounts based on financial situation, no set monthly requirements. Buddhist ceremonies, paid directly to temples based on actual service costs, typically 5,000 to 15,000 baht. I'd paid 10 times what actual cultural participation would have cost because I'd accepted manufactured cultural obligations as real. The following day, I received a message from Achara saying she'd talked with her family and they were willing to forgive my disrespectful behavior if I apologized and confirmed my commitment to fulfilling cultural obligations appropriately. She said they understood foreign men sometimes struggled to understand Thai culture, but that with proper humility and willingness to learn, I could still be accepted by the family. I didn't respond. Instead, I posted in an expat forum describing the specific cultural claims I'd been told and asking if others had encountered similar requirements. I received 37 responses within 6 hours. Not one person confirmed that any of the obligations I'd been told about were standard Thai cultural practice. 12 people described nearly identical experiences with different women. 8 people linked to resources about common scams targeting foreign men in Southeast Asia. The pattern Achara had deployed wasn't unique to her. It was an established, systematic approach used by women who identified certain personality types in foreign men and exploited those personality characteristics through manufactured cultural authority claims. The silent observer personality type was particularly vulnerable because the entire manipulation framework was built on preventing verification through framing questions as cultural disrespect. I spent a week reading other people's accounts of similar experiences. The details varied, but the structure was identical. Woman identifies foreign man who defers to cultural authority. Woman positions herself as sole reliable source of cultural information. Woman introduces progressively expensive financial requirements framed as cultural obligations. Woman responds to any questioning by invoking cultural disrespect or relationship commitment. Woman escalates financial demands until man finally verifies claims independently or runs out of money. The financial extraction was significant, but the psychological impact was worse. I'd lost my own voice so completely that I didn't even recognize it was missing until I finally allowed myself to verify information independently. I'd spent 16 months absorbing assertions without verification, complying with demands without evaluation, accepting explanations without investigation. I'd become a completely passive recipient of whatever information someone else decided to provide. The depression I'd been experiencing made complete sense in that context. I'd erased my own agency so thoroughly that I existed only as observer of my own compliance. I had no opinions, because expressing opinions led to accusations of cultural insensitivity. I had no boundaries, because asserting boundaries led to relationship threats. I had no questions, because asking questions led to emotional escalation. I'd adapted myself out of existence. Recovery required rebuilding capacity for independent judgment that I'd systematically dismantled over 16 months. I started small. I researched one Thai cultural practice per day and verified information through multiple independent sources, including Thai academic resources, long-term expat experiences, and cultural experts. I joined Thai language conversation groups where I could ask cultural questions in neutral environment without relationship pressure. I consulted with a therapist who specialized in manipulation recovery and rebuilt cognitive patterns for healthy skepticism. The process took months. Learning to distinguish between appropriate cultural respect and manipulation disguised as culture. Learning to ask questions without framing those questions as attacks. Learning to verify information without feeling guilty for not immediately trusting authority claims. Learning to set boundaries without interpreting boundary setting as rudeness. Learning to trust my own instincts without dismissing them as ignorance. I never contacted Achara again. I blocked her on all communication platforms. I heard through expat networks that she'd begun dating another Australian man within 3 weeks of our relationship ending. The pattern would likely repeat with him unless he verified her cultural claims earlier than I did. The financial loss was significant, but recoverable. 36,500 Australian dollars paid for cultural obligations that were either fabricated entirely or massively distorted beyond recognition. The psychological impact took longer to address. Rebuilding capacity for independent thought after spending 16 months deferring to manufactured authority required conscious daily effort. What I learned from the experience is that cultural manipulation works best on people who are already inclined toward respect and deference. The system exploits genuine desire to be culturally appropriate by framing all verification as cultural insult. It takes real cultural values like family respect or tradition honoring and weaponizes them by attaching fabricated financial obligations. It identifies personality traits like careful observation or conflict avoidance and builds exploitation frameworks specifically around those traits. The silent observer personality type was perfectly vulnerable to this specific manipulation system. Someone who naturally listens rather than questions, who naturally absorbs information rather than verifies it, who naturally interprets confusion as personal inadequacy rather than potential external deception, creates ideal conditions for systematic exploitation through manufactured cultural authority. Understanding that vulnerability now, I approach cultural learning completely differently. I verify every cultural claim through minimum 3 independent sources. I ask questions without apologizing for asking. I distinguish between cultural respect and cultural exploitation. I maintain boundaries without guilt. I trust my own judgment while remaining open to learning. Real Thai culture is rich and meaningful. Family bonds are important. Respect for traditions has value. But Thai culture as a weapon to prevent verification or to extract money isn't Thai culture at all. It's systematic manipulation that takes advantage of foreign men who want to be respectful and who are afraid of being another ignorant expatriate making cultural mistakes. For anyone watching this who's in similar situation, here's what you need to understand. Legitimate cultural practices can withstand verification. If someone tells you that asking questions about culture is disrespectful, that's a manipulation tactic, not a cultural norm. If cultural obligations always require immediate money without time for research, you're being exploited. If you're told you're the only one who doesn't understand while everyone else just accepts, that's isolation strategy. Verify everything. Ask 3 Thai people who aren't connected to your partner. Google every cultural claim. Post in expat forums. Consult cultural experts. Read academic resources. Actual culture will be confirmed across multiple independent sources. Manufactured culture will collapse under basic scrutiny. Watch for silence, weaponization. If you're naturally quiet or observant, someone might use that trait to prevent you from questioning. If every time you start to form a question you're cut off with cultural assertions, that's deliberate silencing. If you feel like you've lost your own voice in the relationship, you're being psychologically manipulated. Set boundaries around information verification. Tell your partner you need to research cultural practices before complying. If that request is met with anger or accusations of disrespect, you're seeing manipulation in action. Healthy cultural education welcomes questions and verification. Exploitation masquerading as culture can't tolerate scrutiny. Track spending. Write down every cultural obligation and amount paid. Calculate totals monthly. If you're spending significantly more than other foreign Thai couples on cultural requirements, investigate why. If explanations rely on your partner being more traditional or her family being more respected, verify those claims independently. Maintain social connections. Don't allow yourself to be isolated from other expats or from Thai people outside your partner's influence network. Isolation is a critical component of cultural manipulation systems because it prevents alternative information access. Keep diverse social circle that can provide reality checking. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't immediately interpret that feeling as your ignorance. Silent observers often dismiss their own skepticism as inadequate understanding. Sometimes discomfort signals actual problems rather than personal confusion. The warning signs I missed were all visible throughout the process. Cultural claims that changed based on convenience. Emotional escalation in response to basic questions. Isolation from alternative information sources. Financial requirements that escalated without clear limits. Framing of all verification attempts as disrespect or inadequate commitment. Complete inability to explain cultural logic when pressed for details. I ignored those signals because I'd convinced myself my confusion indicated my ignorance rather than someone else's deception. That framing kept me compliant for 16 months, while I paid for obligations that didn't exist. Looking back now from 2 years' distance, I can see the complete structure of what was deployed. It was systematic. It was calculated. It was specifically designed to exploit personality characteristics I demonstrated from our earliest interactions. Achara recognized I was someone who observed silently rather than questioned actively, and she built an entire manipulation framework around that trait. The best defense against that system is simple verification. Real culture can be researched. Actual traditions can be confirmed through multiple sources. Legitimate practices have explanations that remain consistent across different cultural authorities. Manufactured obligations collapse immediately when you ask 3 Thai people whether the claim is accurate. I spent 36,500 Australian dollars learning that lesson. Anyone watching this can learn it for free. Verify everything. Question freely. Maintain boundaries. Trust your instincts. Real cultural respect includes the right to understand what you're participating in. If someone claims that's not how Thai culture works, they're lying.